Measured, conversational. When you read a headline saying that scientists are leaving the United States for Europe, it can sound like just another story about academic politics or immigration rules. Slight pause, leaning in. But if you slow down and really look at what is happening underneath, the story becomes much bigger. What we are actually watching may be the beginning of a structural shift in where global scientific power sits. And that shift is not just about universities or laboratories. It is about money, industry, healthcare, and the long-term economic future of entire regions. Public reporting suggests that a combination of deep research funding cuts and tighter restrictions on foreign students and researchers has begun pushing scientists to consider leaving the United States. Surveys of researchers indicate that a striking share of them have at least thought about relocating abroad. That alone should make you pause, because modern science runs on people moving across borders. For decades, the United States built one of the most powerful research systems in the world, partly because it attracted talent from everywhere. Matter of fact, graduate students, postdoctoral researchers, and visiting scientists came in large numbers, and many of them stayed. Commentator Tone frames this as a political controversy around immigration policy or government budgets. But that surface story misses something deeper. Explaining carefully. Research ecosystems are extremely sensitive to stability. Laboratories rely on multi-year grants. Clinical trials run for years. Careers depend on funding pipelines that cannot simply disappear overnight. When those systems become uncertain, researchers do not just complain, pointed. They move. Diagnostic, slightly ominous. What we appear to be seeing is the early stage of a classic brain drain dynamic. Clear, clipped. If funding contracts sharply and visa pathways become harder, the incentives for scientists shift very quickly. Measured, countries that offer stable funding, easier residency, and institutional support suddenly become much more attractive. Europe seems to recognize that opportunity. Several governments have already launched programs designed to attract researchers who might otherwise have built their careers in the United States. Zooming out, from a distance, this might look like a routine competition for talent. But the scale matters. Underscoring importance. Biomedical research institutions in the United States have historically been among the largest and most influential in the world. When funding freezes or major grant programs are cancelled, the shock does not stay inside universities. It ripples outward through hospitals, biotech startups, pharmaceutical development, and entire regional economies built around research clusters. Steady, explanatory. And once scientists begin relocating in meaningful numbers, something subtle but powerful happens. Networks move with them, collaborations shift, venture funding begins to follow emerging research hubs, deliberate, punchy. In other words, the geography of innovation itself can start to change. And to understand why that matters, you have to understand how modern science is actually financed. Clear, didactic. Much of the research that eventually produces profitable drugs, medical technologies, and entire industries begins with public funding. Governments finance the risky early-stage work that private investors usually avoid. In the United States, one of the central pillars of that system has long been the National Institutes of Health, an enormous research agency that distributes billions in grants to universities, hospitals, and laboratories across the country. Serious, grounded. When large portions of that funding are suddenly frozen or cut, the consequences are not abstract. Slowing slightly, researchers lose the grants that support their laboratories. Postdoctoral fellows and graduate students lose the positions that sustain their careers. Projects that were designed to run for several years may stall halfway through. Somber in research especially. Interruptions can mean that entire lines of investigation collapse. Clinical trials studying diseases like cancer, stroke, or dementia rely on continuous support, trained staff, and functioning labs. Remove those pieces and the work slows or stops. Empathetic, rational. From the perspective of an individual scientist, the decision to leave suddenly becomes rational, matter of fact. If a laboratory cannot guarantee funding for the next few years, moving to a country offering stable grants, relocation programs, and institutional backing begins to look less like a gamble and more like professional survival. Slight warning. This is why even relatively small policy changes can trigger large shifts in global research migration. Observational. Slightly impressed, European policymakers appear to understand this dynamic very well. Programs aimed at attracting international researchers have expanded, and several countries have explicitly positioned themselves as alternatives for scientists reconsidering their future in the United States. Connecting dots. What makes this moment unusual is that Europe is not simply offering academic positions, it is tying research funding to broader strategies designed to strengthen technology sectors, startups, and innovation ecosystems. Analytical venture capital patterns hint at this shift as well. Investment in European technology startups has been rising, with deep tech and artificial intelligence attracting growing attention. These industries depend heavily on the same scientific talent being drawn into research programs and universities. When governments attract researchers, they are not just recruiting professors, they are seeding future companies, patents, and entire technology clusters. Firm, reframing. So what looks like an academic policy dispute may actually be something far more consequential, pointed. The competition for scientists is also a competition for the industries of the future. Lower, more serious. But whenever talent starts moving across borders at scale, we have to ask a harder question that rarely appears in headlines. Deliberate, who actually benefits from this movement, and who ends up paying the price. Balanced, analytical. From Europe's perspective, attracting highly trained researchers is an extraordinary opportunity, laying out gains. These scientists arrive with years of education, specialized expertise, and often entire research agendas already in progress. The receiving country gains innovation capacity without having paid the full cost of training that talent from the beginning. Universities strengthen their departments, startups gain access to cutting-edge research, and national industries gain a pipeline of new technologies. In economic terms, importing scientific talent can dramatically accelerate development in advanced sectors like biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and medical devices. But the flip side of that equation is what the sending country loses. Research institutions that once attracted global talent begin to hollow out. Laboratories close or shrink when grant funding disappears. Graduate programs become less attractive when career prospects look unstable. Over time, this weakens the entire ecosystem that connects universities, hospitals, venture capital, and private industry. Concrete, evocative. You can see the real-world consequences in the kinds of projects that begin slowing down. Empathetic. Biomedical research on diseases that affect millions of people depends on consistent staffing, funding, and infrastructure. When laboratories lose technicians, postdoctoral researchers, or long-term grant support, progress does not simply pause politely and wait for politics to settle. Entire lines of investigation can disappear. Years of work may never reach the stage where it produces treatments or technologies that reach patients. Expository, zooming out. And this is where the economic structure behind science becomes visible, measured. Public research institutions are not just academic spaces where people pursue knowledge. They function as the early engine of entire industries, connecting many of the drugs, diagnostics, and medical technologies that later generate enormous profits for private companies began as publicly funded research projects. Governments take the early risk, universities produce the discoveries, and private markets later commercialize them. When funding systems are destabilized, that entire pipeline becomes fragile. Investors hesitate when the research environment looks uncertain. Startups struggle to recruit scientists if those scientists are leaving the country. Regions that once thrived on research-driven growth can gradually lose their edge. Succinct, pointed. In other words, the movement of scientists is not simply about individual careers, it is about where the next generation of innovation will happen, who will control it, and which societies will benefit from the breakthroughs that follow. And when you step back from the day-to-day political arguments, a larger pattern becomes visible, deliberate, authoritative. Economies that dominate the future are rarely the ones that simply consume innovation. They are the ones that host the institutions where discovery actually happens. Universities, research hospitals, national laboratories, and the public agencies that fund them quietly shape the technological frontier years before new industries become visible to the public. That is why stability in research funding matters so much. Scientific work does not move at the speed of election cycles or news headlines. Steady breakthroughs in medicine, energy, and computing often require decades of patient investment. When those systems are disrupted, the effects can echo for an entire generation of scientists and entrepreneurs, critical of media framing. The media often frames these developments as a story about personalities, partisan conflict, or bureaucratic decisions. But those narratives tend to ignore the structural question we should really be asking. Clear, deliberate. What kind of economic system are we building when public research institutions become unstable? And who ultimately decides where scientific knowledge will grow? Thoughtful, forecasting. If researchers increasingly relocate to places offering stronger institutional support, we may see a gradual shift in the global geography of innovation. Painting a picture, the laboratories, startups, and industries that shape the next era of biotechnology or artificial intelligence might cluster in different regions than they did before. Once those ecosystems form, they become very difficult to replicate somewhere else. So the deeper lesson here is not simply about one country losing scientists or another gaining them. Measured emphasis. It is about how fragile knowledge economies can be when the institutions that sustain them are weakened. Talent follows opportunity, investment follows talent, and eventually the center of gravity for entire industries follows both. Direct to audience. As viewers trying to understand the economics behind the headlines, we should keep asking the uncomfortable questions. Slight urgency. When research systems are disrupted, who benefits from the shift and who quietly loses capacity that may never fully return? And if innovation is one of the foundations of long-term prosperity, what happens when the institutions that produce it are treated as expendable? Concluding, reflective. Think about that the next time you see a headline about scientists leaving one country for another. The real story may not just be about migration, it may be about the slow relocation of the future itself. Shift to channel call to action. Warmer, inviting. And if you find these kinds of structural economic stories useful, stay with me here. Friendly, persuasive, subscribe, follow the channel, and share your thoughts below. Inclusive. The more we look at these systems together, the clearer the patterns of power and incentives start to become.